And we are seeing things change across Washington this afternoon. And here's one of them. You may have seen this portrait of General Mark Milley. It was unveiled just a few weeks ago in the Pentagon. And notably, there is now what we're showing you is where that portrait has been taken down from the Pentagon. As Donald Trump came to power, we're told that the portrait of the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was removed. And highly unusual for a man who served 40 years in the U.S. military. But General Milley got on the wrong side of Donald Trump, and as a result, President Biden issued a pardon for Milley today to warn against any future protection. And Margaret, I know you've spoken with the general. I've interviewed him for 60 Minutes and spoken with him recently as well. He was very worried about his own personal safety and worried about retribution.
Well, it's interesting because he served very closely with Donald Trump as his main military advisor when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. This isn't a relationship at a distance that went bad. He was someone who felt when he took that walk back in 2020 to St. John's and stood in the midst of those Black Lives Matter protesters that he had been pulled into something in terms of appearing to represent in uniform someone backing what Donald Trump was saying in that moment in time, and wanted to make clear that he wasn't trying to cross that line of bringing the military into politics, something that he very clearly spoke out about after the fact. Since that time, really became very clearly someone who was about lawful orders, obeying only lawful orders, making clear that the president is not the emperor or the king. The president is constrained by design by our founding fathers in the role that he has. And Nora, it's not just our speculation that this was removed intentionally. Katie Miller, who is the wife of Stephen Miller, one of the top advisors to Donald Trump and the soon to be director of Homeland Security or advisor to Homeland Security to the president, was posting publicly and posted just a few hours ago that this is coming down. She called Mark Milley a paper pusher, made all sorts of accusations about him. But he served this country in uniform. And in fact, there is also a cost to this for his personal safety. He is one of the people on the hit list for the Iranian regime, because of the role he played in helping to take out Qasem Soleimani, that Iranian general, which he did in part at Donald Trump's direction.
I guess pulling back for a moment, what kind of message do you think this sends within the Pentagon to other uniformed officers who serve the Constitution, not the President of the United States, by design?
You know, Nora, this is something that, and I know you have heard this as well from others, particularly who serve in uniform or have served, how much character, how much judgment, how much rules are just instilled within you as virtues when you take on that uniform, because good order and discipline are part and parcel of having a well-functioning military. So it is really challenging to some of those in uniform to see this idea of loyalty to anything other than the Constitution, of putting aside as well the military, the code of military justice. That's one of the things that came up in the hearing for Pete Hegseth, for example. It's not just because someone's a prude that they don't like that you cheated on your last 2 wives. It's if you did that, you'd be prosecuted if you were in uniform. There are reasons some of those things are in there, and that some of the Democrats in particular in that committee went at Pete Hegseth that way because they were trying to make that point, including the ranking member of that committee, saying, you know, character in this way is something that you are supposed to uphold your troops to, including laws of conduct. How can you elevate people who do not abide by those themselves?
And Robert Costa, Mark Milley had become this symbol for someone who stood up to Donald Trump as president in many ways, too, but just saying, look, you have to actually sign the orders. You can't just go shoot people in the knees, as Mark Esper described in his book, the former Secretary of Defense, to quell a domestic protest, that there are rules and regulations that he, I think, probably spoke back to the president, for a lack of a better word, and Donald Trump did not like that, and then has since been forced with a lot of threats, including Steve Bannon saying there should be a military tribunal, that he should be court-martialed in those words. How has that affected General Milley recently?
Nora, when you sat down with General Milley for 60 Minutes, he had a grave answer to you about his own personal security, that he has taken real steps to secure himself and his family in the wake of the Trump presidency. The backstory here is important. In the days after January 6, 2021, then Chairman Milley did three different things. One, he called in a mill-to-mill call the leader of the Chinese military and reassured them that the United States was stable. He also had a conversation with then Speaker Pelosi where they talked about what they believed was President Trump's mental unfitness for office and his conduct at the time. And three, he had a private meeting at the Pentagon with key officials saying that if President Trump decides to do anything militarily, to make sure that General Milley is read in. Once these comments, these episodes were reported by Bob Woodward and myself in our book Peril, Milley came under enormous scrutiny from Republicans, and he had to testify ultimately on Capitol Hill about the decisions he took on January 6th, 7th, and 8th of 2021. And the consequences of those decisions, as he told you on 60 Minutes, continue to hover over his life. And that's why I'm told by a source close to President Biden, he had built a relationship with Chairman Milley in his own presidency, and he wanted to make sure that Milley felt protected in this new Trump presidency.
I want to bring in Jan Crawford because pardons is a big part of today because President Biden has issued so many pardons in these final days, not only for General Milley, but also Anthony Fauci, and then just at the last minute, an extraordinary move for just about every member of his family.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, those are preemptive pardons. They haven't been charged with any crimes, much less convicted. And those are highly unusual, not unprecedented, of course. I mean, we all remember President Ford pardoned former President Nixon. He'd not yet been charged. So there is precedent for it. But this is highly irregular. And I was thinking, I remember there were some Republicans who were urging then President Trump, before he left office, to preemptively pardon members of his own family and potentially even himself. And obviously, Trump declined to do that, at least his immediate family. He did pardon his
father-in-law,
yeah.
Charles Kushner,
who
is now in
but
a
he had been
diplomatic
charged
role.
and convicted,
And he had actually served time.
Yeah.
He had actually gone through the legal process.
So, I mean, I think, the messages that sends and would these people have been prosecuted? I think, obviously, it's hard to imagine. And then, of course, this is only, they could be prosecuted for future crimes. But it goes to what you're saying, Nora. I mean, the numbers of pardons that we have seen from former now President Biden, I mean, we're talking, what, 4,000? Mm-hmm. And in his first term, President Trump, as he was leaving office, I think, pardoned about 238. So it's quite a dramatic increase here that Biden's done.
It's also interesting to me about Dr. Fauci, who now says he has to travel with security. He released a statement saying, let me be perfectly clear. I've committed no crime. There are no possible grounds for any allegations or threat of a criminal investigation or prosecution. But the fact is, the mere articulation of these baseless threats, the potential that they will be acted upon, create immeasurable, intolerable distress for me and my family. So he says, I acknowledge and appreciate the action that President Biden has taken today on my behalf.
And of course, taking that action is not going to do anything about the threats,
yes,
right? And so that's an issue, I think, that is not unique to whether we're talking about General Milley, Fauci. That is a reality of public service, sadly. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, the threat levels that people are under right now are
actual physical threats.
But does it take away?
I cover the Supreme Court. The justices, there are justices on the Supreme Court who at times have to wear bulletproof vests. I mean, think about that. So, that's again, the pardons don't help that.
But would the preemptive pardons of members of the Biden family, we're not talking about Hunter Biden right now, who has been accused and was convicted. We're talking about other members.
Also pardoned.
Yes, he did also pardon him. But I mean, these preemptive pardons for the other members of the Biden family and for General Milley and for Dr. Fauci. Does that preemptive pardon, though, in some ways say to members of Congress who wanted to hold these hearings and investigate, well, probably not worth it, or do they go ahead and have the hearings anyway?
I think the question is going to be, what are you going to see from some of these state attorneys generals? That's where I think you're going to see some of the real action. Because obviously the president can only pardon federal crimes. I mean, we've seen that with President Trump, right? I mean, he couldn't have gotten a pardon for his state convictions, state court convictions. So whatever you're talking about with Dr. Fauci and being pardoned for any potential federal crimes, there's still a real avenue there for a state attorney general to try to file suit.